How did we get here when it comes to emerging technology and political spending? And what does it look like right now?
One, Citizens United has like completely changed the playing field for how money in politics is spent. It used to be mainly through party committees, like the Democratic or Senatorial Campaign Committee or the NRSC, which is the Republican alternative. And parties really held a lot of power. With Citizens United, like anyone could fund any group to spend money on politics. And you really saw a lot of players sort of move into that space of doing PAC spending in order to get the elected officials that they wanted, right? I do think that, that is the easy way to engage. And generally, when you spend money on PACs and lobbying, you wind up losing people, right? Because every time you spend money against someone, you piss off a large portion of that base, whether it be on the right or the left. And you don't do any engagement with those voters around the things that you care about, it makes it even harder in the long run to sort of get like the regulation and policy world that you want, right? Like, and this goes on in different time frames. I mean, you can look at like the one that the online community is talking a lot about right now is like everyone's going after APAC, and like that, despite putting everything else in the argument around it aside. APAC has spent heavily in races, sometimes against moderates on both sides that didn't have the exact position that they had. And then there was a huge backlash to it, right? That is dominating discourse on the internet. And so I do think that, politically, nobody's really paid a price for this type of spending. And it does wind up shaping electorates, especially in presidential years when you have a lot of uninformed voters or infrequent voters that are just paying attention to advertising. But I do think that like also playing into that was that the left completely sort of abdicated leadership in this space, right? Like, there were multiple opportunities for there to be regulation of digital assets and underneath the Biden administration. There was an executive order that was pretty positive at the early days of it, but really the independent regulatory bodies wound up going after crypto, right? And it wasn't just like, going after the big guys who had money to fight it. They wound up going after like small businesses and developers and people that were trying to play by the rules in an emerging industry. And, the administration and regulatories were cutting off access to banking. We're really being hard on them. And when that happens in an environment where political spending is king, and the ability to buy advertising, and you have a legal way to do that, what it winds up happening is the industry feels hurt and then goes all in for the other side, which is sort of where what has sort of made this sort of one party system, like one party sort of alignment with tech in a lot of people's views. The problem with anything being not bipartisan or not engaged with both sides is that when it leaves the technology vulnerable when there's a change in leadership. At Congress and the presidency, et cetera. And it's not good business to have policy whipsawing between whoever controls the House of the Congress or the executive. And so we really see a future for digital assets, for AI, for emerging tech, but we do think that there has to be engagement at a real personal level in education about this, because nobody really knows on the left much about emerging tech. And so like we have to engage and do a better job of having these conversations in order to drive better policy in the future.
I think so I don't disagree with any of that. I would take maybe like a slightly 10,000 foot level to all of that, only because when I spent a year working on the January 6th committee, and then after that I wrote a book, and the book wasn't about the January 6th committee, but it was absolutely informed by what I learned on that. And because I was looking at the finances and how they were raising money, I was specifically focused on some of the techniques that they were using to raise money. And I think what I learned that I didn't appreciate beforehand is that there is a very deep history that we don't talk about in this country about the history of marketing manipulation and how good people got at getting humans to buy things that they didn't need, maybe that even hurt them, some that even killed them. And there were sales techniques to that. And those sales techniques were wildly effective. And really only, I would say, in like the last maybe 20 years, did political people start looking at, is there a way to take those sales techniques and use them to manipulate people with propaganda, with political propaganda, right? On either side, right? So you have this like hurricane of the rise of social media, the combination of things like Salesforce and CRMs that allowed people to like do A/B testing and figure out exactly which words, exactly what image, exactly what font size. We all like to think that we're super special snowflakes, but the reality is that humans are pretty much sheep. Like we are very, very programmable. And so like there's literally hundreds of years of science called psychology that like studies how human works. And we don't like to acknowledge that, but the truth is that some political consultants actually got really good at saying, I can turn this lever and make them believe this. I can turn this lever and make them believe this. And it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has nothing. It is humans. Whether you're on the left or you're on the right, there are just certain things, whether it's fear, whether it's certain issues, right? Whether it's care for their children, there are things that you can do to get humans to believe a certain thing. It is the effectiveness of marketing and the effectiveness of manipulative communications put into political propaganda, and that's how you get people to vote a certain way. And everything that Eric's talking about, to me, is actually one of the problems that the left has traditionally had, where if your goal is to teach sheep how to do algebra or calculus, that's very difficult. If your goal is to take sheep to water, to food, or over a cliff, that's very easy. And so unfortunately, part of the left's hatred of tech has also been a refusal to acknowledge what happens when you combine the lack of data privacy in the United States, the massive amount of consumer data, geolocation data. There are data sets where I could tell Ben and Eric, I could tell you guys where you shop, what you eat, what you do, what your children are looking at. Like if I was a data broker, I could tell you a horrifying amount of things, more than I could tell you when I worked for the government, believe it or not, right? So like people just don't realize that if you buy enough data, that's why, to your point, Eric, about the PACs, when the crypto industry was doing ads, none of the ads were about crypto because nobody cared about crypto. You want to manipulate people into who to vote for or against. You hit them on the levers that they care about. But the people who were paying for it only cared about the person that they wanted to get into office. Did they have the same issue alignment? And then you just twist the levers on the people using money. And to me, that's the real problem with Citizens United, is that at the time, they didn't know that they were basically opening the floodgates, and that Citizens United, combined with no data privacy, combined with massive amounts of social media data manipulation and algorithms that would get to the point where we could just turn people like levers, would create a level of political manipulation that I don't think has ever been seen before with the scale of the misinformation and disinformation we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, his point that if they spent like 1/10 of what they spent on elections, they could have had like these national conversations about where the future of AI goes. And like, yes, that's true, right? But like, what are the market incentives that are like driving these companies to do it? And to your point, and I think that you're right on about that. I mean, I do think that that's the information world we're in right now. Is it's no longer like 5 channels that everybody's watching, right? Like any person that goes on the internet has literally 10,000 choices for what they're going to consume, and they're going to consume what resonates with them and their lived experience on a daily basis, or what pisses them off and gets them to click, which is what the algorithms are really good at. They want engagement as much as they possibly can.
Agree to disagree on that, though, because like I think you're giving people a level of agency that I think they have too, which is why when they're sitting on Facebook or when they're sitting on YouTube and the auto scroll happens and they don't realize that just simply watching something for 4 seconds instead of 2, or clicking on something instead of just scrolling by, and then the next thing they know, they've got 800 videos on that in their feed. and they don't even know that they're being radicalized either to the left or to the right on some issue. I actually think most people don't realize how they're sitting in a filter bubble, how easy it is to get caught in a filter bubble, and how hard you have to work now because of social media and the algorithms to actually claw out of that filter bubble. You have to proactively seek the information that contradicts your worldview. And I think that's a problem, is that if you assume humans work in a way that is not how humans are actually working, then all your messaging and all your strategy and everything you've been doing doesn't work, because that's not, in fact, what they're dealing with. There are a lot of people I know who started one way on an issue, and then 6 months later, I'm like, they are unrecognizable in their positioning because they've been sitting, digesting, like just video after video, point after point, whether it's correct or misinformation. There's a certain point at which they don't even know, because they've just been ingesting all of the things that the algorithm is pumping to them. And I think that's my fear that's my fear with O'Farrell's point, where I'm like, do you know how hard it is to get people to like attend a talk or sit for a webinar or basically enter into a space to get educated on something that's not already in their current bubble or their feed? Like, that's just not where we're at. And that's my fear, is that this idea that we're going to spend so much, I mean, we have to do it. We should try. But I think we have to have a conversation about, we've got to be a lot better at that. Like, you actually have to beg Americans to be better than we've been. Like, never before has there been a time where we needed more proactive citizenship. Like, you have to, right? Like, and when you look at the voting rates and you look at how hopeless people feel, they think their vote doesn't count, so they don't go vote. So then they don't do research on the issues. There's just like this like state of apathy that is ironically the thing that allows everything to stay exactly the way that it is, because the reality is the only thing that can change it is votes. And if you don't think your vote matters and you're not engaging and you're not looking for this education and information, you are 100% enabling the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, like when I was GC on a general consultant on a lot of campaigns, you know, I always, like, everyone always wanted to spend all their time like reacting to things on Twitter or whatnot, and you know, it's tough for people to understand that, like, in the electorate, like 15% of voters actually read the news, like, you know, and that's like watching the evening news or whatever, right? Like, and it's really only 5% of voters that like are on New York Times, like, are reading like all the best information. 85% of people who vote regularly actively try to avoid the news.
I'm in the 85%, no offense, but after what happened on the Jan 6 committee, watching all the BS clickbait news that they put out that we specifically told them that's not right, don't print that. They printed it anyways because clickbait is clickbait. And look at what happened in the crypto industry. For like 6 months, all we heard about was FTX and SBF. FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. Did you hear anything about Circle at working with the UN High Commission on Refugees to use stablecoins to fund Ukrainian refugees? Absolutely not. Is it sexy to talk about the use cases of emerging tech? Absolutely not. Our mainstream media and for-profit media is literally the cause of the problem in this country. So when you say 5% are looking at it, I'm like, they're the 5% that apparently didn't see it go into the toilet, because the rest of us are absolutely looking for other sources of information, because we do not trust a for-profit media environment that has just hoarded itself out to clickbait news 100%. Like,
please.
So I guess the question is then, is how do we get objective, curated, non-biased, accurate information into the hands of voters? Because I don't believe the answer is the news. I think that model is dying, right? And don't get me wrong, shameless plug for the Open Frontier Substack, right? Like, I'll just put that out there. But like, we are one of how many, right? And like, how do people find us? How do we cut through the noise? I see all this garbage like boosted on Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm like, do we need to be boosting everything? Is that the use of the money? Do we need to get the John O'Farrells to pay to literally say, you're going to have to shove accurate information into the eyeballs of Americans? And that's not mainstream media anymore.
No, it's not. We actually spent a lot of our morning sort of team call this AM going through like a video explaining how clipping channels work and how so basically like there's no such thing as like like a completely organic Instagram feed anymore or stories feed. Like people spend millions of dollars a month paying people in third world countries in order to take clips of their content and then put it out there, and they pay them a cost per 1,000 views, right? And they can make $3,500 if they get 100,000 views on a video, right? When everyone like the big thing that was in parent circles that everyone was talking about was clavicular, right? And like looks maxing.
Oh God.
And this whole thing, like the elementary school group chat had been like talking about clavicular for years, and the reason he got so big was not because like he grew a natural audience, right? It was because Kick and a few others spent $1 million a month almost clipping his content and forcing it into the feeds of people, right? And so that's what everybody was seeing, and it became this huge topic of conversation about how you break your jaw to look better and be an alpha male and do all these like ridiculous things. But that's sort of like what drives a lot of content now. Like anyone that's like in the content creation space, that's how they're growing, right? And it's all sort of resonance based messaging, or like how do you get the most views of things? And it's driving everyone to like these hotter and hotter takes so that they can get more engagement and more clips and more views and grow their channel, and that's how they make money. And I do find that often on the left, like we don't want to engage with that because we want the moral high ground, right? Like, well, it's not right to pay for your stuff if like to pay people to clip it in like Malaysia at like cents on the dollar in order to like win the argument. Like our argument should sing because it works and like because it's poll tested and research based and that's not how it works, right? This is not how any of this stuff works anymore if you're going to communicate out to a larger audience. And like I do think that the author of this piece is right that like I don't think that the political spending is going to be as effective this cycle because everybody is angry about something, and voters generally show up to say fuck you, not thank you in the midterms. And so like it's not going to be as effective, but it will be effective again in 28. And like when you have a wider aperture of who's voting and coming out because it's a presidential election. And that's where, like the left has always believed that turnout is destiny, that like the more people you turn out, that you'll win. In the last election, I mean, David Shore did this research study that if everyone had voted, Kamala would have lost by more because the people that weren't paying attention weren't being even like reached by the left, right? Because they live in these online content channels and like where things are going. Now, if you want to sort of dominate the conversation about AI, I believe that O'Farrell, I believe that his intentions are right? But I think that, a better way to do it is, if everyone's freaked out about AI, it's like, okay, engage content creators, get them to do what works with their audience in order to grow audience around a certain position, and then do that conversation stuff, right? But you got to grow first.
I think there's a bigger problem going back to something I said earlier about like herding the sheep. And that is that it's really problematic on the left if your messaging doesn't lead to a policy. Because if all you're saying is that the other side is wrong and what they're doing is bad and there's no alternative, then why would I follow a person who has no alternative plan, right? Because there has to be a plan. And I think this is the really frustrating thing for those of us who are living in emerging tech, and particularly those of us like with enforcement backgrounds and regulatory backgrounds where we're like, we need regulation, we need responsible innovation, we need like just enough guardrails to protect people. Like, and I think O'Farrell covers this, the possibility for great while simultaneously the possible for the possibility of horrible, right? But the problem is that the left for so long has just focused on the possible of the horrible, and the answer has been then shut it down. That is a non-functional response to technology that every day people are using to make some aspect of their life just a little bit better, but are looking and terrified of but how is the economy going to use it, or how are companies going to, how am I going to make this tiny little bit of difference in my life? I'm using it for crockpot recipes, or maybe it's even giving me investment advice. Great. But then like I lose my job because it just eliminated 30,000 jobs at 10 different companies, and more companies are eliminating jobs because they think AI is going to solve everything, right? And we'll have the hallucination correction, and then they're already rehiring people in some areas. But like, how do you deal with that? And I think the frustration is the left has no engagement, no education enough to understand the technology to put out a plan. And there needs to be a plan. There needs to be a recognition that not all innovation is predatory or negative. And I think that has historically been a problem with the party. And I think you see some new Dems, Richie Torres, I'm trying to think of some of the others. Eric, you would know off the top of your head, but like there were new Dems who very much saw the problem, Ro Khanna, right? Like folks who saw this problem, who were like, hey, from an economic policy perspective, if we want to lead, if we want to be global leaders, if we want to catch up to where UAE, Singapore, and all these other nimble countries are, we need to have a plan for this stuff. And that's the part where I'm kind of like, you have to have the plan and then manipulate the people to the plan. And I think one of the things that really frustrates me with the left is that there is such a thing as manipulation for good. I'm not going to lie. I feel like women have known this for generations and are conditioned to do this. And somehow like that's socially acceptable. But like, you know, we don't really talk about like, but sometimes little white lies, and yes, you haven't gained weight, and yes, you look fabulous, and all these things, right? We're okay in like small doses, but we don't acknowledge why that works so well with humans. And we need to talk about the need for manipulation for good towards a policy that benefits people, even if they don't know enough to know the why. We need to basically sometimes save people from, we need to save us from ourselves sometimes.
Yeah, and the one thing I would slightly disagree with, right, is that, so I do think that when you start like getting really prescriptive on policy and what exactly it is, you lose people. And I think that it's less policy and more vision for what it looks like, and sort of like tent poles, because like, you know, whenever like, you know, like Elizabeth Warren was famous for like putting out like 8 trillion policy papers, right? In her like and like policy for literally everything, and like generally when you get that detailed into a policy, you wind up pissing off about half of people, right? So like especially on the left, because like they're like it's everyone's a freaking valedictorian and like wants to give the teacher the apple, right? And like is very like oh, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, I know more than you do, right? And like, so it's like it's tougher to do that, like do the super perspective policy stuff. I do think what a lot of people really want is vision for a future that sort of like is like shares sort of the benefit. I think people are very angry that a lot of the benefits in like our economy have concentrated in the richest people. I think a lot of people are like, yeah, wages have gone up, but right now are struggling with everyday costs in a way that hasn't changed since the banking crisis. Like, you know, it's not really like just this. It's not Trump, Biden, Trump, like Obama, like right, like since 2008, and this is where crypto was originally a response to the banking crisis because people don't trust banks. You know, people have felt like everything, like they've not gotten any of the benefit of like the American economy, and they feel left out. And that's sort of driven a lot of the angst and sort of back and forth. Like nobody around the world. I mean, look at England. I mean, for Christ's sake, like nobody's getting what they want from their system of government right now.
100% agree, except that the people who are getting what they want are generally people who believe in autocracy and fascism. Autocracy and fascism is doing really well globally. Like the far right is having a great day globally, and democracy is 100% on the decline globally. So, and it's just a question of, do you want that? I have some friends who grew up in Australia. They lived in Singapore. They lived in UAE. They don't even miss voting because they're like, look, if my life is good enough and I live under a benevolent dictatorship and there's just enough benevolence and easy on the dictatorship, like I live a great life. And that is unfortunately a reality that most people don't talk about, that China has 700 million people in its middle class who are perfectly happy who absolutely love authoritarian capitalism. They have kids in school. They are economically stable in a middle class that is growing. And they're not worried about the need for democracy because their current system of government delivers that. And I think people don't realize how easy it is to slide into autocracy if they provide better solutions and a better life, which is the problem that democracy is having around the globe. Because if you just keep taxing people, having terrible regulation, don't have an economic policy for emerging tech, and if you look at the UK, the US, Australia, and major democracies, this is pretty much where they're all at. This is a huge, huge problem. I will say, though, in my book, I talk about the decline in institutional trust globally that you just referenced, because I really think people don't understand what a huge catalyst that is, and it's impacting everything. Like, it is not just a decline in trust in governments, it's a decline in all institutions, the press, doctors, their governments, everything, right? And I think, going back to another point you made, I also talk about the jurisdictions that are winning here are exactly what you just said. It is not policy, it's principles based. Now, you said vision, and that's like how the message is conveyed, which goes back to the very beginning of, you have to be good, right? Like, Ben, I don't think people appreciate the skill set that is comms, but you actually have to be good at delivering the message now, because to your point, Eric, people need vision. They want authenticity. That decline in trust is creating a desperate thirst for truth and trustworthiness. And it reminds me of that line from American President where Douglas, I can never remember the son's name, the actor, not Kirk, but like the guy who plays the president, right? He's talking about his competitor, and he says, you know, the reason they drink the sand is because, like, they've given up hope that they'll find. Well, I'm butchering this quote. Yeah. This is not it at all. But the point is, I was like, that train went so hard off the rails. And I'm like, but the point is like, if you don't give people hope, if it doesn't resonate with them, the best policies, the best like principles resonate with people, policies do not. And principle-based regulation can be changed. And I think what people don't realize, particularly in the United States, is that if you're looking at most of our major financial services regulation, it has not changed in 50, 70 years. Right? Like, we really only got anti-money laundering and counter-financing terrorism after 9/11. After the Bank Secrecy Act had been in place for 30 years, it took 9/11 to get the Patriot Act, which was what we cobbled together, right, in a crisis. But I think what all of us want to put together is something that, like, hey, we should not have to wait for a crisis to have something on the shelf to use to actually move this stuff forward, right? And I think that's what O'Farrell is getting at in the article, is that if we sit down now before the crisis, do education and engagement, and come up with policy that tries to help as many people and prevent damage to as many people as we can, while we're objective and we're not in a crisis, it will be infinitely better than what gets pulled off the shelf if you wait until thousands of people die, thousands of people are out of work. Yeah. And I will say, this is where I get really angry at the left, because there is value to fear mongering when the fear is valid. Like, I hate when the left says, oh, the right does all this fear mongering. And I'm like, okay, yes, sometimes on BS things, but there are some legitimate things that we should be afraid of that you need policies for. And if you don't fear monger about the things that people should be afraid of, you're lulling people into a false sense of complacency, because the answer of shutting down tech is economic catastrophe at a level that's not going to be any better than if you put in responsible guardrails.
Yeah, I know. My worry right now is that a lot of voters right now are just angry, and they're angry at tech. Like, the only thing less popular than the Republican Party or the Democratic Party is AI and crypto, right? In a lot of this polling, and and I worry that that's the jetting up anger and fear is going to be directed towards the tech in a lot of ways, unless we engage well. And actually, that's what Open Frontiers mission is. We got to engage all these people, so that that's not the message that comes out, right?
But
Because
that's such an easy straw man though. Like you're angry at the tech
politics is
because you
about
lose your
straw
job,
men.
right? But the next day you're going to be happy if the tech cures cancer and your kid has cancer, because we are
Yeah,
inherently selfish, self-centered creatures. And it's such a
like the
it is
LGBT
such a
movement.
it's such a terrible it's a yes, everybody knows we need more empathy, but it turns out empathy is actually hard. You have to like practice it. You have to do it, right? And I say that as somebody who can be a real asshole sometimes and isn't the most empathetic person and and often, works on that. But when I think about who people should really be pissed off at, and let's just be honest and call a spade, because you said it like 20 minutes ago. We have all been conditioned to be pissed off at tech or all of these things as if we don't pay taxes, as if we don't vote for people who are supposed to help us in those things. Like, who we really should be pissed off at are a bunch of crappy politicians on both sides who have completely abdicated their responsibilities, who some of which make millions of dollars, some whose husbands make $5 million in one day, who are not doing anything for the public to make them feel safe and protected. And that's a conversation that we need to have about, but this is your job. This is why you supposedly ran for Congress or the Senate. Like, this is what you were supposed to do. Because tech is running around unregulated, not because the AI is doing it, not because we have Skynet, not because LLMs are voting, but because politicians aren't doing their job and voters aren't voting them out. That's the problem. And that we should be angry at ourselves and we should be angry at politicians, because there's only two people in this equation that have the ability to cause the problems and solve the problems. And that's what we have control over.
Yeah, and I think that like some of the anger comes from the fact that it's harder to vote them out because they out resource regular voters a lot of times in terms of advertising spending and whatnot. So electeds wind up like, I think that what Citizens United really brought was that, like, it used to be bad when electeds spent like 10 hours a day calling people that could write $6,000 checks or $4,000 checks. They're not even wasting their time on those people anymore. They're only calling people that can write $200,000 checks to their super PACs. And like, so like their incentive is to completely to serve those people and not necessarily everyday people. And like, that's part of part of the big problem I think that O'Farrell was getting at. I don't like, his solution is very Pollyannish and they should just do this, right? But at the same time, like he does put his finger on like what like the anger amongst voters is, right? Is that like they feel like the money in politics is taking away their agency in a lot of ways, and like, but they don't they don't necessarily put it in those types of words, but they feel like they have no control, right? And that's what people feel. That's what people respond to in polls and like and whatnot as of late.
Ben, you started to say something, and I think I cut you off. Did you want to add something?
You're so fine. I think I was going to say we should wrap on being mad at the people we can elect or unelect, right? Because I think that's the perfect point. But before we close, Amanda, you brought up your book. What is it called? So people can go find it.
It's called The Catalyst, The Accelerating Forces Forging the New World Financial Order. And I will say this, and I don't mean it to be a shameless plug, but it was like my life's work. If anybody has seen the newsroom clip that went viral with Greg Daniels, where he says we're no longer the greatest country in the world, but we used to be because we were an informed populace. Yeah. I wrote the book because publishers really tried to sell you 40 different books about topics that you need to know a little bit about each. And so I wrote this book to be a breadth book, both for policymakers, but for concerned citizens, so that you could understand a little bit about why the decline in institutional trust is a problem, why the rise of nationalism is impacting so many things in finance, why things like disintermediated finance and crypto really matter, right? Like, and what about that technology matters, not crap coins and the speculation, but why are those rails so critical? Why do we have Genius Act, right? Why is it a national security and geopolitical issue? Why is America's economic and political dysfunction so critical now, right? And if you don't look at a little bit of each of those things, it's just so easy for people to get siloed and fed, right? And Eric, going back to something you said earlier, I think about this video clip that I saw on Instagram that was so well produced. And it was these two people pretending to have a podcast. And one guy was explaining globalization versus nationalism. And he said, nationalism is all these beautiful little paint cans and all these beautiful individual colors. And they showed red, green, blue, all these beautiful paint cans. And he said, globalization is the process of just mixing them all together until they don't exist. And they take the paint cans and all of them, like they dump them and they smear them around. And of course, what is the color that it makes? Poop brown, right? Because of course you're going to make globalization poop brown. And I'm watching this video and I'm thinking about the time, the money, the cost that it was to boost it into my feed. And all I could think was, who's making the video that explains the benefits of globalization so that a person has the chance to understand the counter view to this? And I will foot stomp what you just said, Eric. Nobody. And that's where I disagree with O'Farrell's Pollyanna view, is that horse is out of the barn and the far right is running around in this field like a Mustang with its hair in the wind, loving its ability to create that content. And the left is so disorganized. And I don't mean the left in our country. I mean democracy globally is liberals. So disorganized. No, I don't even want to use the word liberals because that has a connotation in the United States that doesn't really translate.
Global. They go back at global liberals.
Just global democracy, right? Like progress, not even progressives, just the concept of progress for people, things that benefit people is so disorganized. And that's where I look at the O'Farrells of the world. That's where I look at the Bill Gates. That's where I look at all the billionaires. And I literally just want to choke them all and say, if you cared about this, if you really wanted to make things better, you'd organize and put your money into effective things that actually make change. But writing an op-ed and saying, let's educate and engage doesn't do shit. Put your money where your mouth is, where humans will actually change, and then we have a shot. But if you don't do that, if you're not making the videos about globalization, if you're not doing the things and putting it in front of humans and manipulating them the way that's effective for good to educate them, you aren't doing anything that matters. Nobody hears it. And that's what's terrifying to me.
Yep.